Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to FOBtv, the future of business. It is here, this very location, where we explore the forces changing tomorrow. So I'm glad you've joined us today. I'm your host. I'm a futurist here at TCS, and I'm really excited to be here today. Now, today we are going to explore the future through all kinds of fascinating and powerful concepts, such as possibility chains, pathways, total systemic domain scores, activation, dispersion, and more. And to help us do all of that, I've invited the globally renowned speaker and writer and principal futurist at TCS, Frank Diana, to join us today. Thanks for joining us, Frank.
It's been a long time, Kevin. Pleasure to be back.
Yeah, Frank has been heads down developing some incredible new tools and frameworks and concepts and perspectives on how to better understand the future and the craziness that surrounds all of us as we try to make sense of both today and in the future. So let's just jump right into it, Frank. Here, you often, when you're working here, return to history as a guide for your work. Talk to us about that. Why is that?
I have found history to be the most informative in terms of signals and how to think about where the world may be going. It's really fascinating to look back and try to find periods that look the same or at least somewhat similar, and then try to understand exactly what was it about that period that we can learn from. And it's been a more than 10-year journey as far as just really trying to become a historian, if you will. And through that analysis, it's been really clear to me anyway that we really have been here before. Maybe not to the degree, maybe not with the speed that we're all experiencing, but we've been here before. And so the lessons from those periods, I just find very informative. They're instructive. They help us think through where we might go in the context of where we currently are. And I think that's the best we can hope for in terms of understanding the future and actioning it, if you will.
So when you look at the past and history, where are you seeing similarities to where we find ourselves today?
So I have looked at, let's just call them ages, these various ages throughout the past that had signs of systemic change, meaning that not just one little thing is changing or one domain, but there's change happening across the broader set of civilizational systems. There were 5 that I landed on: the hunter-gatherer, agriculture, the axial age, which doesn't get much attention, but really the axial age is where most of our philosophical thought came from, our religions, our moral compass, etc. The Renaissance, as it led into the Enlightenment, and obviously the industrial age. Those are the 5 that experienced some level of trauma, if you will, that led to a transition to another age. And that to me is the key. If an age's operating logic can sustain itself, then there really is no transition. When you reach a point where the operating logic of an age can no longer hold, that's when you start to see the signs that a transition is probably likely to another set of operating logics or systems, if you will, to support the age that is versus the age that was. And so those are the 5, and that really is the biggest takeaway from my analysis.
So when you look at those transitional periods of time, where have we been, let's say, over the last 20 years, and where are we going now?
So we are currently still in the industrial age, if you will. And it's interesting to think back in terms of where the industrial age really formed its operating logic. Obviously, it's a couple centuries old, if not more. And the operating logic has been established early on, but evolved. And in my analysis, it looks like actually the 1980s, where the institutions that govern this age really kind of formalized, locked in, if you will. And it's really been since the 1980s that we started this slow walk towards an outdated set of operating logic. So look around you and you can start to see the fracturing of institutions that have carried us through the last 80 years. You start to see stress in every domain. And so when that starts to happen, you start to enter these places that I mentioned where an age starts to transition. And so I believe the last 20 years, and let's go back to like 2005, really represents a period where it started to become clearer that a transition could be underway. And so I really do think, and I named my newsletter this, I think we're inside the next transition and probably have been there for the last 20 plus years.
So you were describing earlier that trauma, there's trauma, and that's what shifts us to the next transitional period of time. What trauma are we experiencing today, and where's that taking us, do you think?
So let's define trauma in the typical way that these transitions have happened. There's really two key terms, three. The limits of an operating logic. Every age has an operating logic, as I mentioned, but there's inherent limitations in the logic. Maybe not visible, but eventually as pressures mount, the traumas, if you will, pressures start to mount, those limits become much more visible, and you see them through constraints. So for example, in the pre-industrial era, the limitations were human scale power. We could only go so far on the back of human power. And obviously with the steam engine, electricity, etc., we overcome the limits of that age. But we created new limits. We just didn't see them at the time, but new limits around the environment, new limits around labor, new limits around cities that formed, etc., etc. And so the pressures that build expose those limits, and they manifest themselves through constraints. So if you think about current times, the coordinating logic of our current environment is stressed. So for example, let's use energy. Mm-hmm. The grid can only hold so much, and it's bidirectional as we move more and more renewable energies into the equation. We have all these AI data centers that are likely to get spawned all over the world, putting more stress on that energy infrastructure, and the coordination of that is pressured. The resolutions become a new form of coordination, and let's say AI automation really takes on that burden. So you start to see the logic of a given age, through that example, give way to a new coordination logic. That's just a simple way to think about how this has progressed in the past and what we're starting to see today.
So I'm going to dig into this term you're using, pressure. I think that's fascinating. But what do you mean by pressure? When I think of pressure, I think something like a balloon. You're injecting air into the balloon. There's pressure. So something holds the pressure. When you talk about pressure, what's holding the pressure?
Well, that's a great way to think about it, because really we're starting to see that pressure needs a release, mm-hmm. right? So instead of something holding that pressure, it's seeking some kind of release valve. An example of a pressure, adults having to learn increasingly because of the world that we find ourselves in, but can't because of the responsibilities that they have, whether it's with a child, caring for an elderly parent, their jobs, et cetera, There's a pressure forming there where on one side you need to continually learn to stay relevant. On the other side, there are too many different things, responsibilities that you have to worry about. And so that pressure forms. So that pressure needs a release. What happens to enable an adult in the future as AI stresses, skills, et cetera, and forces someone down a learning path? What enables that? Where's the release of that pressure, right? So that's a good example of how the learning paradigm of our day may likely change to provide that release.
So pressure, is that emotional? Is that physical? Or how do you see that? Can it be societal and institutional? I mean, how big does that get? And walk me through where you see like the pressure tanks. Where are those that are expanding?
Well, it's all over. So okay. when we start talking through this framework that we try to establish in terms of how to think through this, you look for the pressures that are observable. So in our context, we're looking at 2025 through 2031. 2025 is observable. We already know what happened in 25. So if you look for existing pressures, what pressures formed in 2025, you can start to get a glimpse into how those pressures might play out, the release that it seeks, and through that release, how a future might form. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but pressures in the global economy, inflationary pressure is a very good example, right? That's an obvious one. Supply chain pressures, another obvious one. If you think about healthcare, not enough care providers, another pressure. There's so many of these that really keep track, right? So they span the domains that we track. They span emotion, human capacity, even the environment, right? The environmental pressures that are surrounding us everywhere. So that's what we mean by pressure, and it's multifaceted and it's multi-domain.
And the reason why I wanted to spend some more time kind of digging into that term is because it's kind of central to everything else, isn't it? So you argue that major transitions occur when pressures across different domains begin reinforcing and amplifying one another. Let's talk about a domain. What does that mean to us? And it seems to be central here that when pressures cross different domains, begin reinforcing and amplifying one another. Tell us about that concept.
Yeah, let's start with the domain framework. At the core of this historical work are 7 domains, again, historic. And those domains are science, technology, society, geopolitics, economics, philosophy, and the environment. And what's interesting as you trace this throughout history is that 1 or 2 domains can be active in a given part of an age, but that activity doesn't elevate to the level of systemic change. As more and more domains activate, and in every one of those ages that started to happen, the forces across domains begin to converge. And so one of the key pillars of the stories we've been telling for years now is this notion of convergence. When forces across domains are no longer kind of siloed into domain, but begin to converge across these domains, that's the signal, the biggest signal that you're on the verge of some level of systemic change. Again, historic, we've traced this throughout those ages and actually quantified it in terms of what it meant to a given age. So the 7 domain piece of the framework is critical. It's nothing else really matters. If you can understand those 7 domains and how they're intersecting with one another, you can get a much better glimpse into where things may be going. And so what we've tried to do is analyze the 7 domains, all the forces that we can see, and all the forces that may be spawned in light of the pressures that those forces represent.
So in the domains, you're looking for things that are evolving, emerging, innovations, all those kinds of things which are going to change that domain. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, at the heart of it is, we'll just call it a force.
Yeah.
It can be an invention and innovation. AI is clearly a force, but there's so many aspects to AI that we can consider forces. It could be another force we mentioned a couple of times is in the healthcare domain and not enough care capacity. That's a force, right? And so that's something that you can look at and try to understand what that force implies as far as where we're heading. And so every domain has just thousands of these, and that's really unique to our era. It's really hard to find another age where you just have so much going on at the same time. And the synergistic relationship across these domains influencing each other. And through that influence, what's actually happening is the amplification of impact, because the speed at which things are converging is unlike anything we've seen before. And that speed is amplifying the impact. So without getting into any level of prediction, it does seem like that amplification of impact is leading us towards some level of major systemic change in the next 5 years.
We'll talk a lot about systemic change here in a little bit, but let's go back to the notion of convergence. So you have these 7 domains, you have things changing, emerging, innovations, everything that's going on in each. But it seems like the convergence part is really important, where you have changes across all these domains, but they're all changing together now. Right. And that's where the huge impact is around convergence. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. So the simultaneous impact of these forces and how they link, we'll get into this, but the causal relationship between forces is really, really important, because a force in one domain is spawning another force in another domain, right? So think about what the force at a very high level of an Iran war and what it spawned in terms of supply chain and implications to the global economy, right? So economics is being influenced by a set of forces happening in a geopolitical context, but spilling very quickly over into other domains, societal, economic, etc. So and we'll get into this, but what we're trying to do is link those things, link them in terms of plausibility and how that moves forward. And through that analysis, understand what the next several years could look like.
Got it. So let's move on to the concept of possibility chains, which is a phrase you've coined this year and spent a lot of time working on it and sharing, and it has become central to your work. Tell us how you came up with that concept and why it works so well for you.
So let's go. It was actually last year, maybe early last year, that the first concept of possibility chains came up. And it's interesting how it came to pass. The team's been working on this notion of convergence since at least 2014. And our story to the market in our keynotes, in our presentations, has really focused on modeling that convergence, but at a very high level across those 7 domains. And so we would tell stories at board meetings or leadership audiences that really worked well. But I found that you didn't leave a compelling reason to act. Right, so a good session, a good description of where the world might go, but no leave behind, if you will, that would compel an audience to act. And so I had a board meeting coming up, and in working with the chief of staff to prepare, they kept saying, we don't want to focus too much further out than 18 months. And I kept coming back and saying, I think that's a mistake. Just let me do what I normally do, 5-6 year view. And they agreed. But the takeaway from that conversation was, how do I go into this board meeting with a compelling story and leave that audience feeling like they need to act? And that was the birth of possibility chains. And so the backdrop to this is, how can I show pathways, which is a key construct within possibility chains, that lead them from, at the time, 2025 through 2030, but leaving them with a view into not just what our current day looks like and what 2030 may look like, but how we get there. And it's interesting because it's the middle, that how you get there part of the story, that became the biggest part of the impact. And so in that board meeting, the conversation moved towards focusing on solving a pathways problem. They had the conversation. I just sat back and listened. And it was an inequality issue that was very clear by the pathway I articulated. And this was an investment fund, so a pension fund. So they started talking amongst themselves about different investment decisions they could make to mitigate the risk of inequality. And that's the exact outcome I was looking for. So from that point forward, I believe it was like April of last year, maybe early May, I invested a number of cycles in fleshing out this notion of possibility chains and the mechanisms that drive it.
So why don't you define possibility chains in the best terms that you can?
Sure. So we talked already about forces and domains. Yeah. And how they're linking and the causal relationships between them. So basically saying, if I've observed a pressure in 2025, it will spawn something in 26 and they're causally linked. And that causal linkage continues through the planning horizon, let's just say 2031, which is what we're currently focused on. So this notion of a chain is a chain of forces that are connected. And so they represent possibility, and that's really what the genesis of possibility chains was. And what we're really focused on is not just good storytelling, although that's really important, but plausibility. If a pathway doesn't seem plausible to an audience or to a leadership team, then back to the days of not really driving any action or actionability. And so we invest a lot of cycles in chains of forces that create pathways. And a pathway is simply 6 years, force by force, causally linked, that give you a vision into a given path. So let's just pick one. I use that energy example. What happens if AI data centers really start impacting energy and homeowners and their ability to continue to use energy because it's being drawn by data centers? That's a pathway. So let's just call it a coordination pathway. And the forces that are likely to play out against that set of pressures, what does that look like? And making sure that's plausible. When somebody sees that side-by-side pathway, then the reaction I'm getting now is that they can see how they can insert themselves into this pathway and action it.
So when you say insert themselves, for what purpose?
So every pathway, every chain has a series of upsides and downsides.
Okay.
So if the pathway plays out in a very constructive manner, there's a lot of upside. So we analyze that and we actually make that visible to an audience. Here's the upside if this plays out constructively, but they also have downsides. If this is out of control, if it takes on its own life, if we don't insert ourselves into actioning that pathway in ways that avoid the risks, then there's a series of downsides. And I'm calling that a decision space. In past periods of systemic change, we didn't have the capacity to identify a decision space. These forces were visible, but let's go back to the 1920s and 30s. It wasn't as easy to see them as it is today. So if we create a decision space that says, here's your decisions. If you do nothing, there's a series of downsides. If you insert yourself constructively, here's a series of upsides. And so now you've created that space for a leader to understand the actionability of a pathway and maybe the compelling reason to insert themselves.
So you may have 6 years worth of linked possibilities that could happen, each with their own upside and downside that could happen. You then identify decision spaces where your organization has the agency potentially to influence you, at least your response to that link, right?
Yes. So the example of the inequality pathway and a decision around investments and changing their investment strategy to avoid the inequality downside that they saw in that pathway. Really good example of how that's been playing out more consistently, right? That kind of conversation wasn't happening before. And so what we're seeing is that this concept of pathways, plausibility, and seeing not just a starting point and a scenario, let's call 2031 a scenario, and that's been foresight mechanisms for decades, right? Now you see how you get there. It's that middle that's been missing. And what's really fascinating to me is that because of our short-termism, because of the metrics we use to manage our business, people want to ignore the middle. And I use this in my keynotes, if we didn't do that in the 1920s through 1950, if we didn't ignore what we saw happening and actioned, inserted ourselves, if you will, there might have been some very different outcomes during a really tough time for humanity, right? So I overlay a map of that period in the middle of a chain or a convergence model, if you will, so that you make the point. If we ignore the middle, we're allowing that 2031 period to define us versus the other way around.
You avoid the term predictive or prediction. So what are you delivering in these links? These are just plausible possibilities. And are those defined some other way? Are each of those a different scenario that could play out over each year and over each domain? Or, I mean, what are the steps in that chain that gets you there if there's not prediction? There's just plausible what?
So, yes, as you said, I don't believe in prediction. I don't think we've ever really been good at it as a society, let alone in a period that looks like this with so much going on. And so we think in terms of rehearsal versus prediction. Rehearsal in the context of preparation. So I got a question in a CMO forum a couple months ago. How do you portray confidence as a leader in periods as uncertain as these?
Wow, good question.
Yeah. And the best way to do that is to prepare. And you can't prepare through prediction. You can only prepare, in my mind, through rehearsal. You know, a race car driver that simulates a race in a simulator over and over and over again is rehearsing, right? I mean, the same concept applied to the future. But let's back up just a couple seconds in terms of why this is a little different than other methods in the past. History tells us that futures evolve on the back of pressure, not invention, not great ideas, not people's good intentions, not encyclicals from popes. I mean, with all the best intentions, right? It doesn't change anything. What changes and what drives the future is the pressures that mount and the fact that those pressures have to go somewhere. They have to seek a release, and the pathway is really the mechanism for release. So if you ground every pathway on observable pressures, what you're trying to do then is, where does that pressure go? It's not just going to disappear. That pressure has to go somewhere. And so if you can causally link that pressure to what could plausibly happen, it's not a prediction. It's not that this force is going to happen in 2026. This is going to happen in 2026, but very plausible that this might happen. So for example, if you think about the misinformation phenomena that we all know is happening and the lack of trust in information sources, and the pressure there is you can't trust information, let's just call that as an observable force in 2025, right? Some of the forces that follow will be steps that businesses and others take to try to reinsert trust, right? Whether it's understanding the source of that information, whatever it is. But that's an example of spawned forces that are plausible, right? That get you from lack of trust to trying to rebuild trust by 2031, right? So when people look at this, nobody says that's impossible, right? It's very plausible. So if it's plausible and we're trying to create a decision space where you can action that, you're providing at least a view into what you can do to mitigate the downsides of that path.
Got it. So as a leader, walk us through how this is more effective than traditional foresight to actually lead during periods of uncertainty.
Yeah, and not to take away from traditional foresight methods, which will continue to be very useful. But the simplest way to think through this is in terms of building a scenario or a series of scenarios and trying to understand which scenario has the greatest possibility of playing out. And, if you're making an investment decision, if you're trying to think through innovations that you pursue, those are all really good questions. But they really are based on some probability that a scenario you've come up with is going to play out. And it's a starting point from today. Let's say you're looking out to 2030 and you're trying to make some decisions. You don't have the middle. The difference in my mind is how you get from today I'll call it a scenario, although I don't like the term. I don't like the term only because I want to get away from traditional Foresight terminology and start to kind of insert new language around how this is a little bit different. And so to me, the biggest difference is the middle, is you're actually showing the plausible path from today to, we'll call it a scenario for lack of a better word, but a scenario that, so 2031 looks like this because of how it evolved to that. Right? And so again, you have as a leader at least context. I can see how this pathway could be very plausible. I'm not giving you a prediction, I'm not giving you a probability, but that's a very plausible set of forces that I can see playing out. And so you start to make some choices, again, that decision space. And it's not just one pathway. A chain is made up of hundreds of pathways, right? So we've built learning possibility chains and energy possibility chains. I just built a big AI possibility chain. The learning one I just wrapped up has 62 pathways, and I'm only gating it because you can only do so much, right? And if you look at the possibility chain around learning, it's very clear. For example, we're building videos that tell impactful stories about these pathways. And so I just finished a couple. So a pathway where a student is in a classroom and AI and other mechanisms are guiding that student to where the lesson is supposed to be, but ignoring the fact that that student is really struggling understanding that lesson. But it's taking you there anyway, right? So how does a teacher insert judgment into that process that's forming in a way that helps that student, because the system, which is absorbing the coordination burden, is forcing that student through? Right? So now you look at the forces in that pathway, it's highly plausible. That's where we're going, right? And so what forces evolve to help that student and that teacher in that scenario, in that view of 2031? That's exactly how these things play out. And again, if it's not plausible, if the forces we create in a possibility chain have anybody kind of shaking their head, this is science fiction, it's never going to work. So there's a lot put into the plausibility side of this story.
And we all know there's a lot of unknowns that will come over the next 6 years anyway. So that's why this has to be dynamic and has to be. What's the relationship then between pathways and possibility chains? Which one is a sub part of the other?
Yep. So the possibility chain is the higher order of mechanism. Okay. It captures the full breadth of pathways that evolve in that specific domain or theme that we're focused on, right? So I already mentioned learning.
Yeah.
I mentioned AI. I did a human experience possibility chain for that session with CMOs in India, which was fascinating, right? The human experience, how is our human experience evolving? And through that evolution, what does it mean to a CMO in the context of customer experience? And of course, you can talk employee experience, citizen experience, even community experience. But the chain was human experience. And it had, I believe, 60 pathways. And so those pathways, again, are just various places that our experiences as humans may go. And how do you link that in a forum for CMOs to what it might mean to them as CMOs in the context of their customers? So the chain is the higher order mechanism. The pathways really tell the story of how that chain, that theme is likely to evolve. And the chain is the capsule.
So from an operational standpoint, if you're a practitioner of Foresight and you're wanting to roll these possibility chains and pathways out, 60 is a big number. And a leadership or a leadership team or the board is never going to get to 60 different, chains or pathways and following them all down. So then how do they prioritize the ones they should pay more attention to? What's your thinking there?
So a couple things at the highest order. If we're just presenting to a leadership audience or an event or a forum, we show 62 pathways, but in the storytelling, zoom in on one pathway. I didn't reference category, but it's said very hard to think about 62 pathways, but you can group them into categories. And so 8, 9 categories that really represent the breadth of those pathways, 6, 7, 8 pathways per category. That's really the mechanism. But then you really, let's say I want to walk the audience through 8 categories. I'll focus in on one pathway per category. We're producing really impactful, emotional videos that really help tell the story of that pathway that have been very effective. And so in that context or setting, it's really effective because you're only taking them through, a handful of pathways, but in a very meaningful storytelling kind of way. If there's a workshop or deeper discussion that follows that presentation, then going in, we'll know what kinds of things that audience is wrestling with or looking to innovate around, or what their business problem is. And then we'll focus in on the pathways that resonate with what they're really trying to accomplish. And we've done this several times, where you take the possibility chain and the right pathways and then connect them to more of a solutioning level. What does that mean to them? And how might they solution against a given pathway? So now the connection comes full circle. You start from that higher order view of the future, and you take it all the way through actioning. And in this case, whether it's an innovation or a solution, et cetera, you draw those connections.
So if you're looking at 10 pathways, Frank, and 3 years from now, some of those pathways have kind of dropped off because they're not happening at the same speed as others are emerging, that kind of thing. How do you see it being actually utilized in leadership in a practical way? Is it every year you would review the ones you had rehearsed before, or how do you see that as a leadership tool?
Oh, it's a constant evolution of these possibility chains. As a matter of fact, I'm already like that learning chain I mentioned. I already have one, right? And so for a number of reasons, AI is foundational to our capacity to build these. Without it, I tell people all the time, I need an army of researchers. We need an army of researchers to build these possibility chains. So AI has really been a fascinating enabler. And that's really why I said back in the 20s, 30s, you just couldn't do some of this. And so with AI and its own rapid evolution, your capabilities expand fairly quickly. And so our capacity to do even better at building these chains expands, and it's happening very quickly. Number one. Number two, the first piece of this process is, as I said, understanding the pressures. So we call them ignition signals. It basically is something that is already observable, and again, we're focused on 2025, in a theme. We'll stay with learning, and they constantly get added because new signals emerge. Yeah. Right? So we come up with hypotheses, signals that don't exist yet, but we because we have our own thinking around the future, we hypothesize these things are likely to happen, we insert those. But we're looking for actual observable forces. So if I just let it sit for 4 or 5 months, I'm missing the observable forces that are now new. Yeah. Right? So it's going to be a constant process of evolving these chains, and it represents a scaling issue in terms of this is hard work. This is not easy. It's not easy work. The prompt architecture that was built to do this, there's a prompt that's over 80 pages for one piece of this process, right? So anyway, it's going to be constantly evolving.
Let me put you on the spot with this next question, Frank. Okay. How would you have done this in 1980? I mean, how would this... Is it the fact that it would not be possible until now, and it's the power of AI that makes this kind of thinking practical? Or was there a manual way of doing this back in 1980?
Well, first of all, back in 1980, the convergence across these domains was not as intense, right? So you just didn't have the level of forces that we have in flight right now. So it wasn't as complex back then. But even then, the big management consultant firms that had armies of researchers would just point those researchers at a given problem and research the hell out of it, right? I mean, that's just the way.
Go to the library. Here's your card.
Yeah. I mean, Shell was doing this back in the 60s and 70s. So, I mean, there's been approaches. The point here, obviously, is the capacity of AI to see across all these domains, across a set of information and knowledge that no human could possibly look at. And I really have been fascinated by what AI has been capable of doing in terms of helping build these chains, understand all the forces, create the causal linkages across the various years. It's just a fascinating process.
No, I can imagine. So a couple new terms that you came out with over the last couple of years here. You used the idea of a score, a total systemic domain score, to help measure some of the pressures. And another term, so that's total systemic domain score, and activation dispersion, AD. So activation dispersion as ways to read and better understand the civilization movement and pressure. Tell us how those work and why you found those to be useful and needed.
So it was TSDS.
TSDS, yes.
and AD. So going back to what we described earlier in terms of the historical analysis that I did to understand those ages,
Yes.
one of the key drivers of my thinking back then was let's see how convergence played out in these various ages. I really wanted to kind of put or quantify some of the thinking that went into our earlier views on convergence way back in 2014. And so to do that, and again, AI was a fascinating tool to support the process, I went all the way back to the hunter-gatherer days and tried to quantify the activation levels of those domains back then. And what was
the domains again: science, technology, societal, economic, geopolitical, environmental, philosophical, all that. That's the domains.
Yeah, so those seven, thanks for doing that. For those seven domains, what role do they play in driving the transition from one age to the next and driving that systemic change phenomena that we've talked about? And so it's just fascinating that it played out as I envisioned, and I didn't force the issue. This was a long process of quantifying and measuring it. And so basically it works this way. Back in the hunter-gatherer days, in the early part of that age, the environment was the main domain. Mm-hmm. So as you can imagine, we couldn't grow anything, and people were scavenging and moving around and over again to find food. But as the climate warmed and as we started towards the agriculture age, it activated two new domains, society and economics. Why? Because we had food surplus, which was something we'd never had before. And that led to economics and counting and all kinds of things that started to evolve. So one domain activated two new domains. And so the score basically in those days was low as far as domain activation. And it grew throughout the ages to our current day, which really traces the complexity that we've built in along the way. So the TSDS is really just scoring how many domains were active in a given age.
So you have seven domains, and you said, like 2 are active, but there's nothing going on in science and technology.
Yeah. Back then, right, science was not a thing, right? Yeah. So just to make it clear, I scored them. There's 7 domains, and the score 5 means highly active. A score 1 means inactive, right? So back then, the score was very low because there was only a couple domains involved. By the time we hit the industrial age, that score went to 30, 28, 29, mm-hmm. right? So you start to see how many domains started to activate. Now, this is all important because it really does support this notion that convergence across these domains was the key to each of these transitions, if you will. The activation dispersion talks to how balanced that activation was. So, for example, you can have 1 or 2 domains that are highly active and the others are inactive and still drive a lot of change because of the intensity of that one domain. So the great example is the axial age. Philosophy was a dominant domain. It actually is the age with the highest level of one domain being active. Why? Because we got past survivability issues at some level and people started questioning things like what we used to believe in the stars and all kinds of different things. And so all things were driven by philosophy. So it was massively impactful, but it was really one domain that ultimately activated others. So activation dispersion just talks about how balanced that activation level was. What's interesting in terms of those 2 scores is that current times, our current age, our score in terms of activation is 33, which is only 2 under the 35 max. And every domain is active. I don't think we've ever been there before. So activation dispersion is also very high. So that's the phenomenon. It's complex. No need to get into too much detail here, but the core of the message is the level of domain activation is meaningful in terms of what it meant to an age, and the balance across those domains is as well. And you have to look at both of those.
So when you see high scores where all the domains are active, very active, because things are rapidly developing that significantly impact the lives of people. So across all those domains. So we're seeing right now these 7 domains, they're all active and they're all interconnected. And that tells us what? What does that give us at this point?
So first and foremost, at least it tells me that we, as I said before, are inside the next transition, right? I think it's just a really good way to think about it. If we're moving towards an operating logic change to the civilizational systems that have been in place since the industrial age, then these are signals. This activation level across these domains are signals telling us that we're likely on our path. Now, I'll throw out a term just for lack of, we have to give it a name, right? So when I say we're maybe transitioning to a new age, what does that mean? Well, I've called it the biointelligent age, which could be the next age. And I did so for obvious reasons. One, synthetic biology is not talked about a lot, but the ability to manipulate life, I think, is pretty important. And then you combine that with the ability, where we're heading with intelligence. And those two combined, I believe, represent the core or foundation of a new age. And that's just guesswork, speculation on my part, and just the ability to have a conversation around what it might look like in this next age, right? And so when you look at that, what does this transition look like? What are these pathways that we have to think through that allow us to evolve constructively if we are indeed moving to another age and if the systems of our world are going to change? I think we see all the signs, right? Institutionally, the constructs, post-World War II constructs are giving way already. Geopolitically, we're already starting to see pressures on the dominant world reserve currency in the US dollar. There's just so much going on that would say it's not a stretch that we're inside the next transition.
So let's talk about a little bit about leadership and the impact of all this stuff on leadership. So what kind of executive mindset then is needed going forward when we're not just talking about an isolated innovation? We're not just talking about AI as an IT issue. We're talking about systemic change, where all these things are interconnected. Every one of them are active. Every one is rapidly developing. How in the world can a leader think about that and manage that without being just overwhelmed?
Yes, the $64 million question. So let's start with this. First, you have to accept that the possibility of change in the context of a new set of systems versus change within the existing systems. There's a big difference. If AI and some of the things that we see coming represent change, but they represent change in the context of the existing system, that's very different than change that introduces a completely new set of systems, right? We've only been here several times before, and no leader on the ground today has ever experienced this, right? So there's really no mechanism to go back and say, this is how you do this as a leader, because we don't have those experiences. So we start there. But so the first thing a leader needs to do is embrace the notion that the possibility exists, that it's not just change within the existing system, but it's change towards a new one or new set, right? Once you've absorbed that, then I think urgency goes up. You broaden your perspective in terms of what's possible, what could be changing, and we stop just viewing everything through a traditional disruption lens, right? We've lived through disruption before. We know how to handle disruption, and so you kind of say, more of the same.
More change management. We've got a playbook for that.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest danger, right? If you think that we have the experiences already, we've been through this before, then I think it's a big mistake. I do not believe we've been through this before, at least not the leaders on the ground today. And even the leaders that existed through similar periods will have never experienced the speed and complexity and scale of what's coming.
Wow. So let's talk about what's the required mindset and skills a leader needs then to move forward.
Yeah, well, mindset, one is that acceptance that we just talked about. Two is the capacity to let go of one's beliefs and experiences, accepting that the experiences we need don't exist in our own lifetime. That's why history is such an important piece of the story. And then how do we start to think critically about these possibilities? If we don't really focus in on what's possible, and that we, as you know, we use the what if set of questions versus the what now phenomena. And I think it's an effective way to think about this. What if is a really good way to position these possibility chains and pathways. What if this pathway plays out as these forces indicate is likely or could? And then you kind of think through how you would react, how you would prepare. The key for any leader today is to focus on preparation, right? You can't prepare what you don't know is coming, and you can't prepare what you can't rehearse. And so I really do think rehearsal and that mentality in the leader is going to be very critical.
So let's put ourselves in a board meeting. So we enter the conference room, long table, soft chairs, water, tea, coffee. And we're sitting there and we're looking at a list of top 10 trends that the board goes over. And we look at that in terms of, how that might impact our product line and our customers. But that's not systems thinking, is it? What's the risk of not thinking in systems thinking if you're a board member or a C-level person?
Yeah, that's a great point in terms of, or the first mistake that board made is to still think trends are a thing. You know, I was at South by Southwest and I had an opportunity to present there. And one of the key changes in some of the futurist oriented sessions year over year was this acceptance that trends are dead. And I heard all kinds of conversations around convergence for the first time. And so there's definitely been sort of a mental model shift, at least at some level, in terms of trends. And so that's very refreshing to me because I have felt that trends have been dead for quite some time now. Mm-hmm. So mistake one, focusing in on trends. And then to your point, a systems thinker, and back to this notion of what leaders need to really do well, and that's key. See broadly across the set of systems. And if you don't do that at the force level, if you don't do that across domains, and typically trend analysis has been very technology oriented for decades, right? And so one of the mistakes I still see being made is an overemphasis on technology. And the system is much bigger than that. And when you're living in periods where geopolitics is on fire, right? Economics and global economy is going to have this set of issues going forward. Society, and think about all the societal issues we're dealing with, demographically, immigration, fertility rate decline. I can go on, right? There's so much happening that if you're not a systems thinker and you're in that boardroom thinking trends, good luck.
What do you mean by systems thinking? Because this is so critical to every aspect, because if you don't have it, then none of this makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Tell us what you think of when you say systems thinking, and give us examples of systems that everyone has to be thinking about. Is it the same as domain, or is there some element outside of the 7 domains that we need to be thinking about?
No, it's definitely outside. It encompasses the domains, but it's outside of those domains. Let's use an example. Let's look at learning and education as a system.
Yeah.
Right? There are parts of that system that span all those 7 domains, or at least most of them. And it's likely to get even broader as learning and education changes. And so, for example, learning and education is going to change to where philosophically how we think about learning likely changes as well. So if through a traditional lens, you just look at AI's impact on how a teacher teaches, how a student learns, right? You've got a very narrow lens on the changes likely at the system level. If you broaden that lens and say, all right, well, we're likely going to see geopolitics enter this equation because there are going to have to be rules at some point. And let's say the latter part of this decade, we're going to see more and more geopolitical rules being inserted into this equation. We're going to be wrestling with philosophical questions that we haven't had to deal with in decades around what is learning, what does a degree mean, what skills are critically important, right? If you can't see the system at that level, I don't see how you ever understand where a system like learning is heading.
Wow. And then there's the concepts of second order and third order impacts, right? That just stretch those systems wider and wider.
Yep, and that's happening in spades in terms of the ripple effect across all of these things, right? And so, again, I still see sort of a status quo mentality permeate in terms of how to think about the future, how to use some of these methods of the past to get a better glimpse into that future. But if you don't appreciate that we're just living in a different time, I just think leaders will struggle.
So last week I was at a conference and moderating a panel of kind of leaders in large companies. And the question, which was really interesting, is that people would ask from the audience and other places, where are they seeing implementation of AI within their organizations? Already in 2026, both experts that answered that question said it is everywhere. There is no part of our business that's not being impacted already, from the way, a prospect finds them, or the way their marketing is developed and utilized, the way supply chains are supported and staffed. I mean, every aspect of their business was already being touched. It's not just, how are we going to use this to reduce headcount, or, it's like it's already in every aspect. And that's really the message that I got out of that whole conversation is already in 2026, every business unit is being impacted, touched, and changed on that. Fascinating. Final question for you, Frank. As you study the future, where are you finding hope and inspiration today?
So it's a great question. And we happen to be producing two new videos there's one pathway in the human experience chain that talks about what remains human is really the core of that category, and a couple of pathways in terms of how our bodies are likely to change on the back of AI, bionic limbs that brain activated, et cetera, et cetera. And so the two videos, one is a child regaining sight through, not through the eyes, but through new forms of perception. The person can see, but it's not really because we did anything with the eyes. We created this new mechanism to perceive. And then the doctor in that same video is using those same mechanisms of perception to more effectively understand how to deal with the heart. And then another one that's almost done, how the body learns to leverage that exoskeleton effectively. So when you think about the capacity we have as humans to solve some of the challenges that humanity has wrestled with since we've been on this planet, it's inspiring and actually gives me a lot of hope in terms of what we can do in that decision space to constructively move us in these possible directions. All right, so there's plenty for us to worry about in terms of where the world is heading. But there's also a lot to be really hopeful about in terms of these challenges. And we're already seeing so many signals and signs that these things are possible, and scale is really the only thing limiting us right now. So that's one of the ones that I think about that brings hope.
So what positive developments are you seeing out there that people are just given too little attention to?
The pathways associated with health and wellness and synthetic biology, I think there's a lens there that is very positive, because there's so much that can happen if we do this right. From eliminating some of the childhood diseases to some of the disabilities that kids are born with. Of course, there's a lot of downside to some of those things as well. I don't believe that the positive aspects of synthetic biology are getting nearly enough attention. And I've said this a couple times. There'll be a period in time where the ChatGPT moment around synthetic biology happens. And I don't know how far off into the future that is, but it will happen. And I guess we could say the same thing for quantum computing. I think humanoid robots is having its ChatGPT moment now, partly driven by large language models. But those are the four big ones in my mind: AI, synthetic biology, quantum computing, and humanoid robots.
Fascinating. So, yeah, there's so much to look forward to. What I see is that these have to be purposefully developed, though. They can't be randomly following just the next, investment opportunity. They need to be done purposefully. I mean, because these are interconnected with every aspect of society, regulatory environment, where we put our money and our investment, where our tax dollars go, how we educate our people, every single part. We have to have a plan. So that's, just my contribution is these things have to be purposeful. We don't want them to just happen randomly. And just because, some billionaires willing to invest is not justification for not investing in some other area or investing in some area. We need society benefit to play into that.
Yeah, let's just segue that into, I mentioned Pope Leo's encyclical earlier. I had the opportunity to join a radio show last week and ask the comment on the encyclical. And unfortunately, again, this is sort of the history lesson that I've learned. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII also launched an encyclical. Now think about this. 1811 is when the Luddite movement happened. And a lot of the downside of the industrial age was happening from 1811 to 1891. So it was decades later that the Pope came out with the encyclical that really kind of put a moral lens on the issues of the day, but very late in the cycle. This Pope and the encyclical is happening very early in the AI age. But in my response during that radio show, I unfortunately have to echo history, right? Yeah. Humans don't do the purposeful thing that you just referenced historically. They never have. They didn't do it back then, and they're not likely to do it today. And the encyclical, he's focused on all those things, right? AI cannot just be a mechanism for productivity gains, eliminating labor, the kinds of things that were happening back then. It has to be done in, as you said, a purposeful manner. And the Pope's not saying AI bad. He's saying great things can come from this, but it has to be purposeful. So you're echoing, our Pope, and I'm just really introducing a historical lens to that.
Yeah. Awesome. Frank, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your insight and the fruits of your labor over the last 2 years. So thank you.
Thank you.